our last figure. Este es Estague and Edward L.G. Sobre usa este nombre. Nausa dyan no ano. Usa yung pasida ko ba. All right. So, Travis or Sabina, is there anything before I get started?
We noticed your new look. We noticed your new look.
Oh yes, I trimmed my beard. I lost 10 pounds, and according to my kids, 10 years. So there was a phase this week where my kids didn't recognize me and wouldn't let me forget that they didn't recognize me. Because one of them was like, "Oh, you have a chin," and the other one was like, "You have two chins." It's like, oh, this is why I didn't trim my beard for years and years and years. No one can say you have a double or triple chin if you have a massive beard covering it up. Okay, so just to reiterate what this class was. This class was set up in a way where I picked 10 figures, technically 11, but 10. Chamorro history and Chamorro culture through their experiences, through their statements, through their examples, and so on. So through their existence, we can better understand the story of the Chamorro people in general over hundreds of years, perhaps thousands of years. And so there's lots of things, of course, that we didn't talk about. There's lots of people that we could have talked about. And so I don't want you to ever think that this was meant to say, to tell the entire story, to cover everything, because we could have, I could have picked 10 different figures and it could have gone in a completely different direction. But I chose these 10 figures because I wanted you to think, to think about the Chamorro as a distinct thing, sort of not thinking about the Chamorro as just an effect of colonization by the Spanish, not think about the Chamorro as just a minority within the United States, right? But to try to get at what is the Chamorro experience, what is Chamorro identity, and so on. And so, yeah, all right. And so, yeah, it was very interesting for me, at least, to take on sort of this approach to it. Yeah, because even for me, I found myself going back over a lot of notes, digging through sort of my records and my archives, finding things that I hadn't thought about in a while. And so, very interesting. It's very interesting. So I hope you at least found it interesting yourself. All right, the last person that we are going to be talking about, I almost finished the presentation, didn't quite finish it. And the one requirement for this was that everybody had to have passed away. Right? And so there were some other people that I considered for the last slot, but then I decided to stick to my original condition that everybody had to Estague. And so the last person to talk about is the late Ed Benavente, maga'lahi of Nation Chamorro. And so he is the last person that we will be talking about. And so Ed Benavente was a lot of things. He was an activist, he was a musician, he was an educator, he was a writer, and he was a cultural proponent. He was, as the old people used to say, a jack of all trades. But a new jack of all trades, not the old type of jack of all trades, a new type of jack of all trades. And sort of his legacy is fascinating to me. He is somebody that I knew very well, spent a lot of time with. And when talking about sort of his story, things change because number one, out of all of the people on the list, so I've met several of the people that we've covered so far, but he is the one that I interviewed on multiple occasions over the course of his life. I spent lots of time with him. Even the first time that I met him, it was after Typhoon Pongsonghua, and I wanted to talk to him about his activism and what brought him to critical consciousness. And he made me fix up the roof on his house before he would talk to me. So we spent the afternoon fixing up the roof on his house because the typhoon had just hit. And then once we were done, then he was willing to talk to me. So very, very CHamoru, very old school CHamoru in that way. And so, but he is oftentimes known to people by only one thing, but he really did a lot of things. And in his activism, he represented, and in his community outreach, in his example in a lot of ways, he represented sort of the energy and the vitality of the CHamoru today, pushing for justice, working to preserve culture, to get the return of lands, to assert themselves in a world where there's no longer colonies, but Guam remains a colony. In a world where a lot of people have had their shot at decolonization, but the CHamoru people from Guam have yet to have that chance. And so one of the things that's interesting is that, in speaking to him, he was often very upfront. And so you always want to talk to people who are very upfront about things, who don't sort of hide things away or don't want to talk about things because, it may be embarrassing, it may not be appropriate. So one of the things that he always pointed out is that he may have always been critical or sort of been oppositional to the way things were on Guam. But growing up, he says, like many of his peers, and they had no way to talk about what they were feeling. There was things that they didn't like. There was things that they wanted to change, but there wasn't an infrastructure to channel their energy, their critiques, their desire for something different. And so he says that for his generation, one of the things that they would often turn to is simple violence. At the time that he was growing up, of course, military stationed on Guam, their dependents went to public schools. And so for a lot of people who had very radical ideas or who were very critical, sometimes it would resort to them picking on the children of service members stationed on Guam, fighting with them, because there was anger towards the United States. There was frustration, but you couldn't talk about it in public. There was nothing to do with if you felt like America wasn't treating Guam right. It's not like there was any senators who were in the streets talking about it. It's not like your teacher would engage in that discussion and your priests. And so he acknowledged when I talked to him that a lot of them just took it out on students because they didn't know what else to do. When he was attending the University of Guam, however, that was when his consciousness began to shift. And so one thing that's nice is that for Ed Benavente, if you want to know his story, you can watch the interview that I did a year before he died. And it's in CHamoru. It's on YouTube. It was part of the Honga Motna project, which was funded by a grant from Dr. Elizabeth Kelly Bowman. And so we did 10 interviews, and then most of them all in CHamoru. And then the transcripts are online as well as the videos. And so he acknowledged in the interview so they would beat them up or they would haze them, they would bully them, they would say, go back, go home, Håle. It was like if you were upset about something, then it would be Fakai the Håle Day, something like that. And so the 70s, for example, it was even a time where there was a lot of racial tension between Filipinos and CHamoros as well. And so, but there wasn't a lot of ways that anybody could really talk about or channel what they were feeling. And so when he attended the University of Guam, he took the culture and education class, which was a Guam history class offered by Robert Underwood. And that was something which opened the minds of a lot of people. Guam's history had never really been taught like that. There were some teachers who taught more progressive, critical versions of it, but when Robert Underwood taught it, it was like opening up the island's reality for questioning, for understanding what was going on. There was a piece by Albert Wendt, who was a professor at USP at that time. He read it ferociously, and the next day it was like his mind had been opened up. And so he began to realize sort of that a lot of what he was feeling was tied to all of these histories, these structures of power. And it was the first time that he felt like he should move and he should act for something larger than himself, and that it should be for the lives and the betterment of the Chamorro people, his people. And so still as a younger man, he worked at KUAM. He worked as a DJ, as a radio producer. He was a musician. Ed was a musician, and most famously, he was part of the first Chamorro language talk show, Y Programa en Conversación. And so the man on the right here is the late Sus Satfris, Sus Chamorro, as they called him. So if you like the phrase Oba Scoba, for example, no, that's very true. And that was part of the consciousness back then, was that you were told in all these ways that Guam was part of America, but you were also told in all these ways that you weren't part of America. And so, but there wasn't any critical or good discussions about it, which meant that a lot of people just turned to, I mean, you think about what happened to a lot of the veterans that went to Vietnam that had no outlet for what they were feeling. A lot of them just turned to drugs because the federal government wasn't funding programs to support them, but a lot of them had felt messed up or wrong about what they had done or what they had been asked to do. They didn't understand it. And the community just told them to be strong, be tough, wave the flag. And so that's why you always want a way for people to channel their questions and their passions, their frustrations about what's going on, or else it will oftentimes come out in bad ways. And so Sus Chamorro was a huge pioneer. This is when he received a resolution before he passed away from the Guam legislature, honoring him for his contributions to Chamorro music. Sus Chamorro was probably one of the most influential people in the background. You had people like Flor Bazaquan, Johnny Sablan, who were very influential from the stage, from the recording booth, but Sus Chamorro pushed Chamorro music. Others did as well, but he strongly pushed it at a time when most Chamorros were happy to listen to the Rolling Stones and didn't care about listening to Chamorro music. But they created an industry, which then eventually rooted itself in the consciousness. And so Ed was asked to help with that, be the producer for the Programa en Conversación, the Chamorro language talk show that they had in the morning on KUAM, on the radio. And that added a whole different dimension to him too, because he was already critical about Guam's history, critical about Chamorro identity. But by working alongside Sus Chamorro, who spoke beautiful Chamorro and really embodied the creativity in the language, you know, and the creativity of the language is not necessarily something you study for, but it's flowing with the language and being able to string words together and ideas together in a way that makes people laugh, that sounds harmonious to the Chamorro ear. Sus Chamorro was very good at that. And so working closely with Sus Chamorro gave Ed a deeper appreciation about the Chamorro language. Even in his interview, he says that, you know, he didn't speak the greatest Chamorro, but by working with him and other musicians and on the radio, like about the word, the Chamorro he was using wasn't as deep as what Sus Chamorro was using. And that would instill in him a lifelong love of the Chamorro language, which then we would see grow to fruition in other ways. I was going to put the lyrics for one of their songs here. This was the greatest Chamorro rock band ever. They were called Chamorro. They released one album. I have it on CD. It's called a Tiempo. And it was, it's awesome. It's awesome. So you can find a few of their songs on YouTube. If you have a copy on CD or on tape, it is a really good album because because Chamorro musicians had made political songs in different ways, in very indirect ways. We talked about Clotilde Gould. For example, Clotilde Gould wrote political songs, but they were very much in the indirect Chamorro way. And one of the main ways that Chamorro musicians critiqued the times was to talk about how the food on our table is changing. What are we losing? What are we losing when we stop with the tatidzas and we start to eat the toast and jam? You know, what are we losing when we give up, you know, the escabetsi, we give up, you know, the lemai, and we replace it with mashed potatoes and hamburgers? And so for most Chamorro musicians, that was how you expressed your critiques about the time. But the band Chamorro was explicitly political. In fact, they had a song, very catchy song called Federales, in which they're calling out the federal government for mistreatment on the island. There's the song Mangi Chamorro, in which they're calling on the Chamorro people to stand up for their island and for their rights. And then several good songs. There's some nice romantic songs on there too. Some nice mood songs, and sort of some songs to romance too. There's a few songs on that album too for that. But so Ed Benavente is here on the right in the image. You may be familiar. This is at the piano. This is Fred Berdalio Jr. So he ran for senator this time around. And Mike Phillips, the attorney, is right here. And so great album. There was just a few records. There was some records, and I wish I had one of those. I have it on tape, I have it on CD, I don't have it on record. In 1980, that was when a fateful sort of meeting finally happened between two sort of kindred souls. And so Ed Benavente and Angel Santos. And so one of the funny things about them is that as Ed notes in sort of his statement here, is that as he was going around the island, people would always ask him, hey, Kogwa Comento Santos and say Angel Santos, have you and Angel Santos ever spoken? And then Angel Santos would go around and people would ask him, hey, or tell him, Ed Benavente. You should talk to this Ed Benavente guy. And so as they went around the island, people were always telling them, do you know Angel? Do you know Ed? You should talk to each other. You guys should hang out. You guys should meet. And part of it was because both of them were talking about things in a way that most people didn't. They were being critical of the federal government. They were talking about the rights of the people. They were talking about Chamorro pride in a very political way. And so people kept pointing them in each other's directions because they seemed to fit. They didn't fit in everywhere else, but they fit. They seemed to fit well with each other. And so one night, Angel Santos had just left the Air Force, and he had lots of questions about a lot of things. He called Ed Benavente on the phone and said, "Hey, can we talk?" And then Ed said, "Come on over to the house." And he says, "We in the temple matatsun ham nados." That day the two of us sat tula notseha all night. Maga'lahi comentos but todu esantuni in effect. He says that night, literally all night, the two of us really talked about what was affecting all the issues affecting our people. It was truly a beautiful gathering that night. Because what would come from that gathering is a group called Nashon Chamorro. Now, eventually a group called Nashon Chamorro. There would be other groups that would form prior to that, such as the United Chamorro Chetlus, the Chetlus for Independence and stuff like that. But what would really drive that was people such as Angel Santos and Ed Benavente in other families and other circles who were, the black sheep. They were the ones that were always asking the questions that no one cared about or no one wanted to deal with. And so what happened is that these groups formed. That's true. Yes, he was very radical. Yes, he was portrayed as a radical. Yes, and so all of these people eventually they gravitated towards each other, and they came from all different types of backgrounds. What's interesting about Nashon Chamorro is that you had people in it who were veterans. Many were disaffected veterans. They had been mistreated in their military service. Um, some of them in Vietnam went to Vietnam and had sort of their consciousness had been awoken. You know, some had been passed over for promotion. Some felt it was wrong that they had to kill people who looked more like them than the men who were ordering them to do the killing. There was also people that had lost land. Their families had lost land after World War II to the U.S. military buildups. And there was also those who were just, you know, who were just sort of chunky scholars, people who had deep thoughts, you know, and get a couple beers in them, and they're ready to write the Chamorro Constitution. And so all of these people who didn't quite fit in, they all gathered together and started to create their own sort of momentum and energy around like, well, what are we going to do about it? What should we do about it? And so the group Nashon Chamorro, or Chamorro Nation, was formed in 1991, and there was a ceremony at Laddystone Park. And in that ceremony, Angel Santos had always said that those lati were powerful to him. And so whenever he was struggling with something, he would like to go to those lati, the lati set there, and he would like to pray to the ancestors, feel the energy from them. And so in the ceremony on Liberation Day that year, these activists, these community members came and gathered and then had a ceremony in which they officially started the Chamorro Nation. And it was very much modeled after like a tribe. They saw themselves as being like a tribe of Chamorros. And in fact, the leader was called like the maga'lahi, but they also called them the tribal president, the tribal representative, and so on. Now, Nashon Chamorro was different than Chamorro activist groups in the past. Many Chamorro, the previous generation of Chamorro activist groups, like we talked about Clotilde Gould, she was part of groups like OPIR, Organization of People for Indigenous Rights, Harapada. Those were groups which had a reputation, and their membership showed it, for educated advocacy. So if you look at OPIR, you had people such as Laura Souder, who has a PhD, you know, Robert Underwood, who has an EED, educational doctorate. You had a lot of people who were highly educated, who, you know, and so it was seen as sort of a middle upper class advocacy group. Nashon Chamorro was a grassroots group. You know, people had educations. Some of them had bachelors, but some had just high school degrees. Some had never really finished school. There was people who were farmers, ranchers, fishermen. You know, there was people who were Surahanus, who still lived closely connected to the land. And so it was more of a grassroots movement in that sense. And because it wasn't as connected as intimately to the political landscape, you know, because, you know, you think about a lot of the people who were part of groups like OPIR before, many of them were connected to those who were senators, who were governors, and so on. With Nashon Chamorro, they had less of those connections, and so they were willing to take stances which went against the norms at that time, went against what was supposed to be appropriate or civil. And so, for example, on the right here, this was a notorious protest that they did where members of Nashon Chamorro went down to Suman, and they had signs that were translated into Japanese. And as Japanese tourists were driving by, the signs reminded them about how they had slaughtered Chamorros in World War II. And the signs demanded that they apologize to the Chamorro people and that they pay reparations to the Chamorro people for what they had done. And this shocked a lot of people, because people are like, no, don't chase away the Japanese. We need them for our economy. But the members of Nashon Chamorro were like, they need to know the truth. We shouldn't erase our own history to make them feel better. They should compensate us for how they treated us. And so that's what really defined Nashon Chamorro, was a willingness to defy what was considered to be gai respective, gai mamalo, and to trend into what is tai mamalo, what is inappropriate, what is wrong. This is a quote from Ed Benavente when he was talking about how difficult it was when they were trying to open the minds of people. So Nashon Chamorro was an organization which was dedicated to the returning of Chamorro lands, the promotion of Chamorro language and culture, fighting for Chamorro rights, and it was, in a general sense, dedicated to independence for Guam, or at least decolonization. And one thing that they constantly encountered was what they called the brainwashing of their own people. And so this quote comes from when Ed was describing how when they first started, they would try to go village to village, meet in like a gym or a community center and have an open meeting where anybody in the village could come and talk to them, ask them questions about independence, about self-determination, about getting land back, about saving the language, anything like that. And Ed said sometimes they would have like one person come, sometimes they might have 20 people come, and sometimes they would have 5 people and all 5 of them, and that Guam belongs to America and they should shut up. But when they would have a crowd of Chamorros, sometimes they would be able to get a crowd of Chamorros. And so when they would do that, Angel Santos, one of the things that he would do in order to try to help people understand how naturalized their sort of brainwashing had been, he would ask them to remember a famous commercial for Rolaids. And how do you spell relief? And then everyone would answer Rolaids. And then Angel Santos would say, no, man, Latsiamzu. You spell it like this, Relief. And this is how we have been brainwashed by America. We don't see things the way they are. We see things the way that they tell us. And so it's a simple sort of thing. And so that's an interesting question. I don't think I'll have time to get into that today. But that was something that definitely led to the problems within the group. And so what made Nashon Chamorro very, very notorious on the island was their direct action protests. And so these protests included blocking access for to military facilities. Most famously, they would block access at what's today Potts Junction, which is the intersection that you have to go to get to Estague. And they blocked it because there was a huge struggle between the government of Guam, private landowners, and the US military about who controlled access there. And many landowners who privately owned land in the Estague, Hinapsan, in the area there, they were having their access restricted by the military, sometimes having to wait hours to get passes, sometimes being told they couldn't go to their lands. And so those families then combined with other families who had land taken after World War II and who wanted the land given back. And so they blocked access. They also engaged in sit-ins. There was 2 very famous sit-ins in Adelup, lasting months, connecting to what they called over the issue of the implementation of the Chamorro Land Trust. So one thing that Nashon Chamorro rallied around was giving land to landless Chamorros and getting land back to the families that had lost land to make the bases after World War II. And so there was a law that Paul Berdalio and the legislature in the 70s had worked on, modeling after the Hawaiian Homestead Act, which would allow for landless Chamorros to lease land. And it became the Chamorro Land Trust. However, it was never implemented. And so Nashon Chamorro protested, had these sit-ins, had them twice, first to implement the law because the law was on the books, but no governor had wanted to implement it. And secondly, to finally seat a commission or a board so it could finally act. And that was a big thing. The Nashon Chamorro was successful through their protests, through their lawsuits in getting the government of Guam to create the Chamorro Land Trust, to implement and start the Chamorro Land Trust Act, which has provided land to thousands of Chamorros in the decades. Now, it has many problems. We don't have time to get into them, but it was sort of the biggest success of Nation Chamorro was to get the land trust finally implemented. Now, one thing which made Angel Santos in the consciousness of people in the 90s too radical, too crazy, sort of outside the limits of civil society, was when he and others jumped the military fence at Tidsan. When you go to Guam today, the area Tidsan used to be Naval Air Station Agana. Naval Air Station Agana. And it was a base which the military didn't really need. And part of the problem with it had been the civilian airport was surrounded by a military base. And so the civilian airport couldn't grow. And even prior to that, there had been decades after the Organic Act was signed where the US military controlled the airport on Guam. And so different governors had tried to get it in civilian hands and also eventually get the land around it to be returned so the airport could expand. Now, on the left here, Angel Santos and members of Nation Chamorro are visiting with people at the base, and they're reminding them, or excuse me, and they're presenting to them a statement and a petition from people that live in the MTM, Mongmong Totomaiti area. At the time, what had been happening was the Navy had been doing certain types of drills, and they had been flying very low when they were coming in for landings. And they were flying in so low and so hot that it was creating all early morning, late at night, it was creating like huge, like a burst of sound, which was shattering windows, which was scaring people. I mean, there was a number of Manamku living in the area who were getting PTSD because they would wake up on the island in 1944. And so Angel Santos and Nation Chamorro agreed to go and petition the Navy and ask them to stop this training because it was hurting the people. And of course the Navy said, no, we're going to do whatever we want. And so there was a protest planned to sort of show their displeasure. And according to several of the people that I interviewed who participated in it, it wasn't necessarily planned ahead of time that they were going to jump the fence, but they felt frustrated, they felt angry, they felt like they were being ignored. They felt like they needed to do something to sort of to get the people to pay attention. And so a group of the men in Nation Chamorro jumped the fence in front of the military police. When they reached the other side, they were promptly arrested. And as was caught on video, Angel Santos then spat in the face of one of the MPs that was arresting him. And that became something which you know, people, it was already a controversial group in a lot of ways. Angel Santos was controversial, but that made it too controversial for a lot of people. And people began to really associate Nation Chamorro with this terrible disrespect for the military and so on. Now, eventually Angel Santos, after the Nation Chamorro had sort of their first victory over the Chamorro Land Trust, they had made a decision that some of the members and some of their allies would run for the legislature to try to make change there. Angel Santos stepped away from Nation Chamorro, and Ed Benavente became the second maga'lahi of the group. And then he is the one that also continued more protests after that. For his advocacy, Ed Benavente was honored with a prestigious fellowship. He received an Alston Bannerman Fellowship, which was for activists of color who have worked for social and political change. And so he was given a stipend of $15,000, which he could use for any purpose that he wanted to, in order to, whether it was to take a break, to clear his head, to conduct research, to travel and learn from other places as to what they're doing. And so I believe 15,000. Okay. And so this was a time when Nashon CHamoru, interestingly enough, before the internet, when Nashon CHamoru was in the 90s, Nashon CHamoru was already becoming well known around sort of progressive circles in the Pacific and in the United States. So, for example, the late actor and political change activist Russell Means, Native American leader, Lakota, I believe, he came to Guam in 2000 because he had heard sort of about what the people of the island of Guam were struggling with, and he came and gave a presentation. He spoke to the people, and that Angel Santos was invited to represent Nashon CHamoru in the tribunal, the famous tribunal that put the United States on trial for its crimes against sort of the indigenous people and people around the world. And so Angel Santos went and testified on what had happened to the Chamorro people. And if any of you have seen a video which was shared on WhatsApp last year pretty heavily and put on Facebook, where Angel Santos is speaking in Hawaii on a microphone, sort of, I think it's outside Iolani Palace. That was part of that trip. And so, so yes, it really sort of put Guam on the map in a lot of different ways, this advocacy. And Ed Benavente was, so Nashon CHamoru, what's interesting about the group is that it was very, Angel Santos was always the face of it, but it was a lot of people in the background who were making things happen. And that's one of the issues. I know that Antoinette brought up the issue of sort of women in the group, and women were the backbone of the group, but there were issues of tension between in terms of what is the appropriate roles for men and women in the group. Because some of the men had ideas that sort of, as the maga'lahis, as the men, as the warriors, you're always in the front. Women are organizing in the background, and that's the way it is. And most people were okay with that, except when it was making decisions about what the group was going to do. Then men would tend to take over the decision making and wouldn't give the same power to women to help make decisions. And so it did lead to quite a bit of tension in the group, because over what the role of a magahaga and what the role of a Chamorro woman was supposed to be, because a lot of the women believed that they should be more empowered in the group, and some of the men said, no, your role is in the background to organize and to support. Camacho was elected governor in 2002. There was his campaign had a concern because that they needed to make nice with sort of activists. Nashon CHamoru was sort of declining in power at that point. They were still meeting. There was another group, an umbrella group, which was meeting, which was trying to keep sort of the Chamorro rights struggle alive. That was the Colonized Chamorro Coalition. But in order to try to sort of make an olive branch, or I guess in Chamorro you would say the offering of pugwa to the activists, he invited Ed Benavente to join his cabinet. And there was questions within the group, is this appropriate? Because they saw Felix Camacho as not necessarily being sort of the most critical, not necessarily being a super, supportive person for a lot of their things. But Ed decided eventually that he was going to be in the cabinet, and he was going to do whatever he could to sort of to help the Chamorro people. He was made the director of two agencies. One, the Commission on Decolonization, and the other is the Guam Ancestral Land Commission. The Chamorro Land Trust is the famous sort of agency. The Guam Ancestral Land Commission gets a lot less attention. but its role is slightly different. The Guam Ancestral Land Commission exists. Part of its mandate is to provide land for those who should have their land back but cannot receive their land. And so, for example, one of the things is families that had their land taken to build runways, families that had their land taken after World War II, and now there's a runway at the airport. And you cannot give them the land back because the island needs the runway. So the Ancestral Land Commission was supposed to find ways to compensate, usually by giving other lands, deeding other properties. And so Ed Benavente pushed hard the Ancestral Land Commission, especially in the Tidzen area, which had been returned 10 years earlier, to get families land. And it was a contentious issue because the federal government was pressuring the government of Guam not to give land back to people, because the federal government didn't want sort of private landowners around there, because if the military buildup was going to happen, if they were going to increase their presence on Guam, they wanted the airport to be larger, and they didn't want all these private landowners in the area making things complicated. But Felix Camacho stuck to his guns, supported Ed, and they returned hundreds of acres of land to families through the Ancestral Land Commission. And so this is a part of it, this is one of the ceremonies where they're signing deeds and giving lands back to some of the families. And so this came with a cost, though. So Felix Camacho is the governor who did the least in terms of political status change. And part of it was, in a sense, that he didn't understand it. He didn't think it was important. He thought it might piss off the United States to try to engage in any discussion around decolonization. And so under him, it kind of dissipated. And it was something that Ed Benavente regretted, but it was, in essence, he could either get support for giving land back to Chamorros, or he could try to push to try to get support for decolonization. And he chose to give land back to Chamorros, but that was the better choice out of those two. But the conversation around decolonization at the governmental level disappears under Felix Camacho. It's almost non-existent, even to the point where every year the government of Guam, including the governor, can go and testify at the UN and have their trip paid for. But under Felix Camacho, they didn't even use it. They refused to use it, fearing it would irritate the United States or show disrespect to them if they did. Now, after leaving politics, sort of the rest of his, and even while he was in politics, Ed Benavente adopted a very different view of what was needed. He had been engaged in direct action political activism for quite a while. You know, he had sort of done a very frontal and direct approach to it, and certain gains had been made, but the more that he saw that, the more he saw things evolve and change, the more he realized that politics and speaking directly about political things was not necessarily the best way to reach people. It was not necessarily a good way to elevate consciousness, to open minds, right? I mean, some of you may have experienced that. If you don't like somebody's political opinion, the worst thing you can do is try to talk to them about it and argue with them about it, because then they will almost instinctively just dig in, right? So what Ed Benavente dedicated the remainder of his life to was trying to promote language and culture, feeling that that was how you could empower the people and open their minds more. I believe two. There may be a third one I'm forgetting right now. But he wrote 2 books. These are from Iman Manyanata, which is our elders, Iman Maga'lahi, then Iman maga'lahi, Gigeran CHamoru en Español, which is the maga'lahi book, which is the book which sort of has, it's bilingual Chamorro and English, and it has biographies about the Chamorro maga'lahi who fought against the Spanish and a few who fought for the Spanish. He does in it acknowledge, and he has a short essay about Iman Nagahoga, sort of about Ifamalau and Chamorro, in which he regrets that the Spanish indicated the strength of Chamorro women and that their power in society, but that they did not give them names and they did not draw attention to them, so that he could not include stories and biographies of them in the book. He also wrote a children's book, Sinapud and Si Isa, both of which were illustrated by Rathon Pinko. And so that's a quote from him down there. The fact that we still call ourselves Chamorro testifies to the strength, the survival of our people. It's very true. If you look at a lot of other peoples who went through sort of similar things that the Chamorro people went through, many don't think of themselves as a distinct people anymore. They have been subsumed within larger populations. And even if Chamorro may not be what ancient Chamorros referred to themselves as, the fact that we still consider ourselves to be distinct, it represents the survival and the strength of the people, even if things change. And this was sort of Ed Benavente's his passion project, and a lot of other people's passion projects, but he was one of the main people that was leading sort of to make it a reality and to sustain it. This has had many names over the years, but now it is regularly referred to as Sagan Koturan Chamorro. And so this is overlooking the Hilton Hotel in Tumon. Many people call this Oka Point. It's not really Oka Point, it's Sakban Point. But and so this was Chamorro Land Trust land, which a number of groups and nonprofits such as Haral, the Escuela and Haral, were able to get, and I think it's like 15 years ago. Boy. And so they were able to get a few acres, they were able to get the houses that are on there, and they wanted to turn it into a cultural center. And so each house would represent a different cultural art. There would be one for dance. The plan has changed different times of the years, one for weaving, one for carvers, one for language. This was like, for example, where the Haral school was supposed to be for a while Haral was homeless, trying to find a place to have their daycare and their classes. And so Ed Benavente was, in many ways, the heart of this operation, which was all volunteer. And so him and other volunteers would bush cut, they painted, they remodeled sort of the buildings, and they worked for years to try to get and so the family tried to get the government and sort of the business community to support, and there was always promises. But one of the sad things about this is that there's still not regular electricity and utilities at this facility. And even more than a decade later, different administrations have patted themselves on the back for supporting it, but they've never really supported it and sort of given it and helped sustain it the way it needs. And so this remains something, when thinking about what do we need to do into the future, we don't need to do a lot of new things. There is always sort of this feeling that what we need to do needs to be new. No, a lot of times something has already been done, something is already happening, but you need to sort of humble yourself to connect to it. And so the Sagan Koturan Chamorro remains one of those things which could be huge, but there's always this lack of support for it. And so when you come to Guam, remember, always try to visit Estague Koturan Chamorro. If you do, the widow of Ed, Jill Benavente, is one of the main people there. She sells beautiful jewelry. She was honored as a master of Chamorro culture for body adornment, for the making of jewelry. And she is the one who made my Sinahi. She's the one who made my Sinahi. This is my PhD Sinahi. I might have mentioned to some of you, she made this for me when I left Guam. And she told me that it was free as long as I finished my PhD and came home. And that if I didn't, I would have to pay for it. And one thing that I always liked about it is that this Sinahi comes from the groove in the Hema, or the giant clam, which is right next to the groove that was Ed Benavente's Sinahi. If you're close to whoever has made your jewelry, then you can always ask where it comes from, because there are important connections. So for example, if you have a Sinahi, then you can ask and they may know who has the pieces next to that, and there is supposed to be a connection between them. Oh, and he was also, okay, and Ed was also a CHamoru teacher for a very long time, most notably at JFK, John F. Kennedy High School. And we were both instructors at the University of Guam. Oh my goodness, dispenses. Hold on, wait. Because it is almost Chempon Pascua. It is almost Christmas. All right, hold on. Let's see. Can you guys hear? Magas na song Isabile, 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 Isabuda Kapitana, Sai Messias Mahafanyagu, Gilizang Dara Gizahagu, Isabilen, Tano Jesus, Magas na song Isabilen, Isa. Oh, hello, can you hear me? Okay. So that's Ed Benavente in the back. Oh my goodness, it's so funny. So this is when I was teaching CHamoru at UOG, was the head of the program. And so this is us preparing for Appointment Menago from Cebuena, which was our annual CHamoru Christmas celebration, where we'd have Belen competitions. We would try to make as many different types of buñuelos as humanly possible. We got buñuelos aga, buñuelos dogu, buñuelos manglo, buñuelos nika, buñuelos piña, buñuelos manga, got buñuelos manha. Even somebody tried to make buñuelos sandija once, which was not very good. Watermelon donuts, not so good. And so, but yeah, so Ed was a longtime CHamoru teacher. He was somebody who instilled in people, not just CHamoros, but other ethnicities too, sort of like a passion for the language, a feeling of responsibility for the culture, for the island, for its resources, in, teaching them not just that CHamoru stuff is about sort of Mali and Pari, right, and Fiesta, but that it's also about injustice and justice. And so, but this is so funny because this is a video I took when we were trying to figure out the lineup of songs we were going to make our students sing. And I was like, Dandani Pandaretas, Van Makum and Hengi was Makpo, and we go home. That's it. That's it. Me not being Catholic, I was always like, let's do the minimum amount of songs as possible. But all of the old ladies, such as Rosa Palomo, Rufina Mingiola, and then Teresita Flores, they were always trying to think about the most old school songs. She's like, what's the one that I haven't heard in 60 years? Let's go sing that one. The one that I can't even remember the tune for, and we're going to sit here for 30 minutes trying to figure out what the tune is. And then I would always be like, oh man, let's do Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and CHamoru. I know that one. No, I would always tease. I would always tease them too. And they would always tease me too, because I was, because my family is the Protestant. We're the Protestant cabeza. And so, I would always, I would always be like, I don't know any of these songs. I don't know any of these songs. No, no, but I always liked it too. But I always did like to tease how they would be like, no, no, let's sing this one. And I'd be like, what the hell is that song? Gotta go into the archives to find the lyrics for this song. I've never heard that song before. Right, dispensa. All right. The legacy of Ed Benavente. He passed away in 2016. And so when he passed away at Independent Guahan, we made we made a meme with one of our favorite quotes from him. I may not see decolonization in my lifetime, but I can leave this world knowing the next generation will continue to fight for the rights of our people. And that was something that I always loved and admired about Ed Benavente, is that, and this is coming from someone where Ed Benavente, people oftentimes tell stories about about their experiences with Angel Santos. You know, I talked to Angel Santos. I never got to sit down and interview him because he was already sick by the time that I was trying to do those sorts of things. But I sat down and talked a lot with Ed Benavente, and I always admired the intelligence, the critical thinking, the strategic thinking that he brought into it, the way that even his approach thinking about how we need to empower ourselves culturally. Because if you empower culturally, then it's easier to reach people politically, right? If you want people to hear you in this way, reach them in another way first, and it makes it easier for them to hear you. But all of the many things that he and others did so that the next generation would not have less passion, but have more passion for things like their language and their culture and the rights of their people and their land. That's one of the beautiful things that we can look at for that generation of activists, is that, and this is something which, as I've traveled around the Pacific and Asia, Japan has a very strong peace movement, for example. Okinawa has a very strong and very sort of famous protest culture there. But Japanese and Okinawan activists, whenever they come to Guam, they're always amazed at how young people in Guam are interested in these sorts of things. Because whenever I've gone to Okinawa, for example, and organized with groups there, it's almost always manamku. And they're always expressing that young people don't want to carry on the fight. Young people aren't interested in these sorts of things. But one thing that's nice is to see that for CHamoros, those who have come before planted the seeds. Some of those seeds may not have been intentional, some of them may have been intentional, but to really bring it out so that the next generation will have the resources, they will have the infrastructure, so that they have places to put their questions. They have ways to answer their questions. I mean, even just Ed creating a book which talks about ancient Chamorro figures, the first of its kind, by the way, self-published by himself. And it was something that he had first produced for Chamorro studies in the public school system so that teachers could use it. And then even him just creating something like that then makes it easier for the next generation who has questions, who are looking for things to read in Chamorro, who want to know. Oh shoot. Oh shoot. I think I'm supposed to be in another meeting. Oops. All right, hold on 1 second. Let me start the other meeting. Okay. And so actually, yes. So one of his daughters, Amber, for example, she's a Fafanagui. She has her own dance group on Guam. And so she has helped she's worked with Independent Guahan in the past. She's helped bring in the dance groups so that they can perform chants and so on. She's also been working to try to create a documentary about Nashon Chamorro, sort of, and she has beautiful collages that her family made of the news clippings of those times in the 90s when they were fighting for land return, fighting for their rights, and so on. So, hold on. Oh wait, hold on. Okay. And so, yeah, I like so yes, and she's trying to. I know that she received one grant for it, um, and I was working with her as a scholar for a while on it. And so that intergenerational focus is definitely something that I've tried to remind you about as we think about this, right? Is that sort of the choices that you make now impact the choices that the next generation will have or won't have, right? And so thinking about even something as simple as how much in your house is Chamorro or reflects sort of that heritage. You know, because for some people who grew up not knowing a lot, sometimes all that they knew was that there was a Guam poster or there was giant spoons and forks on the wall, right? And so what can you pass on? What can you create for the next generation so that it is easier for them to pass on, to continue the fight rather than feeling lost, you know, that they have to do everything anew, that they have to start everything over again. Right. And so, right. Sidus Masi. Ha ha ha. Jade, which I got. It was, they had sort of the Asian jade. And then when we moved out of that house, my mom was like, "Get the jade. Make sure you get the jade," because that was what she associated with my grandparents, the jade that they had gotten from Asia or Hong Kong or something like that. But so as I was saying at the beginning, these are 10 figures. They don't tell the whole story, but they do tell. Oh yes, absolutely. She definitely does. But they're put together in a way for us to think about our history in a more active sense. All of the figures that were mentioned were the figures who, in their struggle, in their accomplishments, even in their failures, they help us understand the times in which they lived, but they also provide us examples and models for what we may or may want to do looking ahead. Right? Last week when we talked about Bel Areola and Anita Areola, right? That was an interesting conversation because you had one side of the argument feeling that we should decolonize and that we should be self-determined so that we can protect our culture, even if it means restricting a woman's access to abortion rights, right? To abortion services. That's part of the complicated nature of the culture, right? Is that it never makes perfect sense. You'll always have different sides of it, and you'll always have different people pushing in different ways. And one thing that we should always think about is that you can't ever get everything you want. So for example, if you want Chamorro to be more collectivist and more communal, then if you look into the past, part of that is the de-emphasizing of the individual, right? It's the de-emphasizing of that. And what does that mean then in raising your own kids? Does that mean, because a lot of the way that we feel we should raise them today is actually against the way that Chamorros would have raised their children in the past, right? For example, Chamorros in the past wouldn't tell their children you should be true to yourself, because that's not something that you should do. If you're true to yourself, it means you will give less to the family and to the village and to the clan. And so I'm not saying anything in particular one way or the other for this, but if you want to learn from that history, it helps us understand what we might need to do today if there's certain things that we want to sort of bring to life. If we look into our past, because if we decolonization, it can be about looking into your past, finding things that you might want to bring back into the present, but then thinking about how you might do that. And is it gonna be just a t-shirt? Is it just gonna be sort of a tattoo? Is it something going to be living or not, right? I was talking to somebody from the village of Inarahan, because I'm trying to, COVID sucks for so many reasons, and one reason is because I haven't been able to continue my oral history project, but I've just started to do them over Zoom. And so I was talking to somebody from the village of Inarahan, and they were talking about when they were growing up, how everybody was singing in Chamorro all the time. And we talked about it before, and it was this beautiful sort of thing, and was remembering that people would come together and that they would fish almost the entire village, and that the shoreline of the village would just be covered in songs, people singing, people like jumping out of one song and jumping into the song from the group next door. And they're like, that was so beautiful. You know, it's so bad that we lost that. But could we ever get that back again? If you want to understand how you could get something like that back again, then you have to understand how history works, how culture works, how identity works. Because it is possible to revive things. We've seen it with Chamorro dance. People would have thought in the past that reviving or recreating Chamorro dance was impossible, that you could never do it. It's happened. And it's a vibrant part of life, and it leads to empowering youth. It leads to small parts teaching the language. It leads to greater ways to represent ourselves to the world. There's all these ways that it does it. But so that's the way that I teach history is because I want you to understand how things change. Because I always want us to think then about how we can imagine then the future in light of that change, in understanding of that change. What were the choices that were made? What were the forces at play? If we wanted the Chamorro language to be healthy and vital again, what would need to happen for that to take place? If we wanted to refine some of the values that we've talked about in this class and in other classes, what would it take? Thinking about that. Because most of the people that we've talked about in this were ahead of their time in one way or another. And they were people who sort of saw changes on the horizon, saw things through and disappear. And so we can have those same sorts of questions. We can have that same sort of outlook. And so yes, that's always, yeah. Yeah, and I wanted to thank all of you for hanging out with me on my Thursday mornings, or your Wednesday nights for most of you. Because for me, a lot of this just was that I have like boxes and boxes of papers, like photocopied files and documents on a lot of these different things. And this gave me a chance to pour through them, to try to arrange them in certain narratives, so that those sorts of things don't just sit in all the boxes, which my daughter always wants to throw away, but that it makes it out somewhere into the world so that people can know those stories, people can benefit. And so yeah, this is definitely part of intergenerational censuring, me doing this. is that when I was in my early 20s and I went around and I wanted to know things, I was fortunate that people were willing to talk to me and that people were willing to tell me stories. People were willing to sometimes feed me Vienna sausage, which I hate, while they were telling me those stories. But what always struck me and what always made me feel strange, though, was that I would sit with somebody and I might spend like an entire afternoon with somebody. And then they might tell me all these stories, but I would wonder why they weren't telling their grandchildren those stories. Like, why is it that I'm hearing these things and these things are amazing? You know, why is it that, you know? And so, yeah, for me, it became this issue of hearing all of these things, writing all these things down, collecting all these things, but then also wanting to make sure that they don't disappear. That's interesting. Not a really good one. Not a really good one, or like a deep one for it. But yes, so I want to impress upon you the need to tell the stories that you've heard here, other stories from your own research, from your own family. The word that is always used in the past for this type of thing is opshiki. Imbilikero. Imbilikero means nosy. And so they always used to say that if you were a young child who was asking questions, they would call you imbilikero. They would say, Ibastu imbilikero, stop that. You're always wanting to get into the, they always shoo you away, right? And so it's unfortunate, but all of the people who I look up to in the CHamoru sort of universe were all imbilikeros. Mm-hmm. Because they were all the ones who listened while the adults were and the elders were talking. They were all the ones who asked the questions, and they were all the ones that got the genealogy. They were all the ones that got the stories. And so, people such as Tony Palomo, sort of historian, writer, who the museum is named for, even somebody like Peter Onodera, sort of playwright, poet, instructor of CHamoru, even somebody like Laura Sauder, Dr. Laura Sauder, imbilikero. And so I encourage all of you to be imbilikero. And so whatever I've taught you over these 10 weeks, you can use it. You can pass it on however you want. But whatever you learn and whatever you find, pass it on too. Find those ways to pass it on, because I think our people would definitely benefit if we were just generally more imbilikero in a positive way. In a positive way.
Miguel?
Positive way, not like getting into the drama of everything, right?
Miguel?
Yes.
Can I ask you a question? So obviously you've interviewed many of these figures, but who would you have liked to have interviewed from the past that you couldn't have interviewed? And who do you think you would have liked or disliked the most? Like,
that's a good question. I was thinking about putting him on this list. Francisco Baza Leon Guerrero. He is the person that I would have loved to talk to. He passed away 9 years before I was born. But he was ahead of his time in so many ways that he was ahead of his time in so many ways. And he was an attorney on Guam, but he had become an attorney via correspondence courses because he couldn't go to law school on Guam. And he was an attorney at a time when no CHamoru attorneys would do divorces because it was against the church. He was one of the two that went to DC. CHamoru men could have a place where they could talk about the future of their island. And he was also somebody who said when CHamoru's were leaving the land, he argued that as long as we are close to the land, we will always be strong. And when all of his contemporaries were saying we need factories, we need, you know, all of these fancy things, he was like, no, as long as we are connected to the land, we will always be strong. And but yeah, he would always refer to himself as machete scientist in the later years of his life. And he, in the 60s, he said that because he had a reputation for being anti-American because he protested the U.S. on lots of different times, but he said that he was an anti-American, but you know that he believed, and this was before most anybody else said these sorts of things, that if America wasn't living up to its ideals in Guam, you had a duty to make them live up to their ideals. And so I definitely would have loved to talk to him. I mean, I think I might have. We talked about Padre Palomo in this class, the first CHamoru priest. Okay, no, I don't. So Father Duenas, who we also talked about, I don't know what he would be like. I have a vision in my head of what he would be like. He may not be the way that I would hope, but I collected enough stories about him that I think he would have been cool to talk to. But no, but Sidus was here for that question. And so I have to go. I'm in another meeting right now, technically. And so I wanted to, I wanted to say thank you to all of you, and Sidus Masi no Hamzu no Dos Lokwe, Sabina and Travis. So Hamzu Muna Possibly Esti Tatlo. I'm always happy to help Håle Para Agupa. I think, and so, yeah, if you wanted to do something else next year, I'm happy to. I'm always happy to. After all the discussion recently about Operation Christmas Drop, one thing that I had mentioned on Facebook the other day was talking about Guam's history and present through Guam movies. People found that to be interesting because there's movies that have been filmed on Guam, movies that are set on Guam, and talking about that. I always wanted to do that. So I don't know. I'm up for anything, really. But yes, most of you are connected to the language classes, but don't forget on the 19th, the Casidzas. I know Antoinette, you're presenting as part of that. And I think that's the only person here.
I'm not done writing yet, and I'm nervous. So
remember, get it to me so then I can record it for you if you want to, so you can hear the sounds. I can have Samahi record it. I can have Samahi record it.
But only if she does it in the Valley Girl. With the Valley Girl.
I think she can do the Valley Girl for you. But Sidus Masi no Todos Hamzu was a lot of fun.
Let's see, we get.
Sidus Masi, Senor, I know you said you had to go into another meeting, but cannot communicate enough. Who agradeci how we, I appreciate you so much, and Håle Para Agupa always appreciates your availability and always making yourself at our disposal and to continue these discussions. Again, I'd like to say that, Håle Para Agupa was probably one of the first, if not the first, to pioneer the online learning, in reference to Chamorro language and Chamorro culture. And so we're just excited to, finally be able to complete another session. I won't keep going because I know you have to go, but thank you very much. Everyone else, we appreciate the support. We hope that you really enjoyed the course. I'm getting over a cold. I have walking germs in my house. My children got me sick. So I apologize for my voice. But please keep out to your emails. There's going to be some final kind of tying ups and loose ends that we need to finish up with this course. And then obviously we'll be talking to Senor and others because we definitely want to continue discussion and be on the lookout for the next offering that we hope to have in the spring. Adios.
Adios.
Tia Antoinette, did you get my message?
Yeah, I did. I'll stay behind now. Actually, everybody's leaving. I was going to try and get a screenshot of the class, but everybody's
Oh, I think we actually, I know that I have one from another class.